She rose before dawn every day, long before the rooster cried or the big house stirred. The air was cool then, heavy with mist rolling in from the river, and for a brief moment the world felt almost gentle. That was the hour she loved most, when silence still belonged to her. She would step barefoot onto the packed earth, carrying the baskets of linen on her back, feeling the familiar ache settle into her shoulders like an old companion. By the time the sun rose, the ache would be unbearable, but at least in the beginning it was honest. Water defined her life. She washed in it, worked in it, bled into it. The river curved behind the plantation like a long, patient serpent, slow-moving and brown, hiding its depth beneath a smooth surface. The master liked to say the river was a blessing, that it made the land fertile and the work easier. To her, it was a witness. It had seen everything. It remembered what people tried to forget. Her hands were always raw. Soap lye cracked her skin until it split, and the boiling water scalded her wrists so often she barely noticed the pain anymore. She scrubbed stains that never seemed to disappear, blood, mud, wine, sweat, proof that even the finest clothes could not hide what people truly were. Sometimes she wondered if sin clung to fabric the way it clung to memory, impossible to wash away no matter how hard one tried. She was known as the Laundress, nothing more. No one used her given name anymore. On the plantation, names were shortened, bent, or erased entirely. The master's wife barely looked at her, except to complain that a collar was not white enough, or a sleeve smelled faintly of smoke. The children, still young enough to laugh without fear, treated her as part of the background, like the wash tubs or the wooden fence. They would run past her with wet feet, splashing water onto her skirts, never once apologizing. She watched everything. That was her survival. She watched who drank too much, who prayed loudly but sinned quietly, who smiled in daylight and screamed after dark. She learned the rhythms of the household as well as she knew the current of the river. On Sundays especially, the plantation dressed itself in righteousness. The master read scripture aloud, the wife hummed hymns, even the overseer pretended gentleness for a few hours, his whip resting against the wall like a sleeping snake. Easter was approaching, and everyone talked about it as if it were a promise. New dresses for the children, a special sermon, a feast that would leave the enslaved with scraps and aching stomachs. Resurrection, they called it, renewal, cleansing. She had heard those words her entire life. As a girl, she had been baptized in the same river where she now worked. The preacher had held her under the water until her lungs. Easter morning arrived, wrapped in false purity. The plantation woke to the sound of church bells drifting faintly from the road beyond the fields, their rhythm steady and solemn, as if calling every soul to account. The big house stirred earlier than usual. Floors were swept twice, mirrors polished, and the smell of baking bread drifted through open windows. White fabric appeared everywhere, tablecloths, dresses, ribbons, each piece scrubbed and pressed until it gleamed, as though brightness itself could erase what lay beneath it. The laundress had been awake since long before dawn. Her sleep had been shallow and uneasy, broken by dreams that left her breathless. In those dreams, water filled her mouth and ears, heavy and silent, pressing against her chest until she could not tell whether she was drowning or being baptized all over again. When she rose, her hands trembled as she gathered the final baskets of clean clothes. The master's children's garments lay on top. Small shirts, delicate socks, white frocks stitched with care. They smelled of soap and river air, too clean for the world they lived in. She carried the basket toward the yard as the household gathered for church. The master emerged in his best coat, his Bible tucked under one arm. His wife followed, adjusting her gloves, her lips already set in a pious smile. The children skipped ahead, their laughter light and careless, their shoes still too new to know dust. They passed the laundress without seeing her, and she lowered her eyes out of habit, though something inside her tightened at the sound of their voices. Sunday was supposed to be different. Even the overseer spoke more softly, his eyes lingering on the Bible as though it might absolve him simply by proximity. The enslaved were lined up, instructed to bow their heads, to sing when told, to look grateful. Faith, on this plantation, was another form of labor, performed, monitored, enforced. The sermon was long and heavy, with words about sacrifice and forgiveness. The master's voice carried easily, practiced and confident, echoing across the yard. He spoke of Christ washing away sin, of rebirth through suffering, of obedience as virtue. The laundress stood at the back with the others, her hands clasped so tightly her nails cut into her palms. She listened, as she always did, but today the words pressed against her in a way they never had before. Each phrase seemed to scrape against memories she had buried deep. She remembered another Easter long ago, when she had still been young enough to believe the words meant something. That year, she had worn a borrowed dress and sung hymns until her throat ached. That was the year her child was taken from her, sold away with no warning, no farewell. The master had said it was business, had said God provided, and God took away. She had screamed until her voice broke, until the river swallowed the sound. No sermon had ever spoken of that sin. When the service ended, the plantation shifted back into its familiar rhythm. The white family gathered inside to eat and rest. The enslaved returned to work. Holiness, it seemed, had a time limit. The laundress was given her task shortly after noon. The master's wife called her over, gesturing toward the river with a gloved hand. The children's clothes had been worn during the service and the play that followed. Grass stains marred the hems, and one of the boys had spilled syrup down his sleeve. The garments needed washing again before evening, she said sharply. They must be perfect for supper. The laundress nodded and took the basket without a word. The children, curious and restless, followed her despite their mother's protests. They liked the river. It was freedom to them, a place where rules loosened and shoes came off. They ran ahead, kicking up dust, calling out to one another, their voices echoing in the warm air. The path to the river felt longer than usual. Each step stirred something inside her, a tightening in her chest she could not name. The water shimmered through the trees, brown and calm, its surface broken only by the slow drift of leaves. She set the basket down near the bank and began her work automatically, kneeling, dipping the cloth into the water, wringing it out with practiced strength. The children splashed nearby, chasing frogs, daring each other to step deeper. Their laughter carried across the riverbank, sharp and bright. She tried to focus on the rhythm of washing, the scrape of fabric, the splash of water, but her thoughts would not settle. The sermon replayed in her mind, twisted and distorted. Cleanse, forgive, rise again. One of the children asked her why the water was brown. She told him it carried the earth with it, that it remembered where it had been. He frowned, unsatisfied, and ran off again. Another asked her if God lived in the river. She hesitated before answering. God sees everything, she said quietly, which felt safer than the truth she wanted to speak. As the afternoon wore on, the sun climbed higher, pressing down with relentless heat. Sweat rolled down her back, mingling with river water, until she could no longer tell one from the other. The children grew tired and sat on the bank, their feet dangling in the water. They watched her work with idle curiosity, unaware of the storm gathering behind her calm expression. She remembered all the times she had stood in this same place, washing clothes while grief pressed against her chest so hard she thought it might break her open. She remembered nights when the river had whispered to her, promising silence, promising release. She had always turned away, clinging to survival because that was all she had left. Survival had been her rebellion. But survival had not brought peace. The river moved slowly, endlessly, carrying everything away, dirt, blood, tears, secrets. It did not judge, it did not remember faces, only weight. Standing there, she felt the years collapse into one another, past and present blurring until her own pain felt inseparable from the water itself. The children stood and waded closer, their white clothes darkening at the hems. She told them not to go too far. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. They laughed and ignored her, splashing one another, daring the river to do something worse than wet their skin. Innocence, she thought bitterly, was a luxury built on other people's suffering. A breeze stirred the trees, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. She looked down at her hands, red and cracked. and saw every year of her life etched into them. She thought of all the sins wash away in this river, and all the sins it had been forced to keep. The basket was nearly empty now. The work was almost done. The sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows across the water. The children stood close together, their reflections wavering on the surface. Something inside her settled then, not peace, not rage, but certainty. The kind that arrives when all other choices have been stripped away. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply looked at the river, at the children, at the sky above, and understood that this day, this place, had been moving toward this moment long before she ever knew it. The bells rang again in the distance, calling the faithful back to their tables, back to their comfort. The river flowed on, unchanged, waiting. And the laundress, kneeling at the water's edge, felt the weight of silence press down upon her, heavier than any command, heavier than fear. The river did not rush. It never had. It moved with a patience that felt ancient, as though it had learned long ago that everything came to it eventually. The laundress stood at its edge, the water lapping softly against her ankles, and felt that patience settle inside her bones. The children were still laughing, still unaware that the world they trusted was balanced on a thin and fragile edge. Their voices rose and fell like birdsong, careless and light, echoing across the surface of the water. She folded the last clean garment with deliberate care and placed it back into the basket. The task that had defined her life for so long was finished, at least for the moment. There was nothing left to scrub, nothing left to wring out. Only the river remained, wide and waiting. She watched the children as one might watch the weather, not with affection or hatred, but with a distant, almost clinical attention. They belonged to a household that had taken everything from her, her child, her name, her faith, her sense of time, and yet they themselves were not monsters. That was the cruelty of it. They were simply the inheritors of a system that had never asked them to question what it consumed. The boy bent down to scoop water into his hands, letting it spill through his fingers. The girl followed, her dress catching the light as it brushed the surface. White cloth darkened, heavy with river water. The laundress felt her breath slow, each inhale measured, controlled. Panic would ruin everything, emotion would weaken resolve. What was unfolding now required stillness. She thought again of Easter, of the sermon spoken only hours earlier, of sins washed away, of innocence restored, of sacrifice demanded, but never truly shared. The words had lodged themselves inside her, sharp and insistent, refusing to fade. For years she had carried sin that was never hers, guilt pressed upon her shoulders like the weight of wet cloth. She had prayed for relief, she had begged for justice, she had waited. The river had waited too. She stepped closer, her movement slow enough not to alarm them. The water was cooler here, pressing against her calves, steady and grounding. The children turned toward her, curious but unafraid. They trusted her because everyone trusted her. She was the quiet one, the harmless one, the one who washed what others dirtied. For a fleeting moment, doubt brushed against her resolve like a passing breeze. A vision of turning away flickered in her mind, of gathering the children, scolding them gently, returning them safely to the house, of continuing as she had always continued, enduring, surviving, but survival had cost her everything already. She reached out, not suddenly, not violently, but with a strange tenderness that surprised even her. Her hands were strong from years of labor, steady from repetition. The children did not resist at first. Faint confusion crossed their faces, quickly followed by fear as they realized something was wrong, something they did not understand. The river absorbed sound easily. It always had. Words, cries, prayers, none of them traveled far over its surface. The laundress focused on her breathing, on the pressure of water against her skin, on the solidity of the earth beneath her feet. She did not look away. She did not close her eyes. This was not rage. This was not chaos. It was an act shaped by years of silence and grief, moving with a terrible, deliberate calm. Time stretched, warped, lost its meaning. Seconds felt like hours. The world narrowed until there was only water and weight and the relentless pull of inevitability. She felt the children struggle, then weaken, their movements slowing as the river claimed them with indifferent certainty. When it was over, the water returned to its gentle rhythm, smoothing itself as if nothing had happened at all. She stood there for a long moment, her hands submerged, trembling now despite her efforts. The basket lay abandoned on the bank, its clean white contents untouched. The river flowed on, carrying away not only what it had taken, but the sound, the struggle, the proof. It was as if the act had been swallowed whole, leaving behind only silence. She did not scream, she did not fall to her knees. She simply stood, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the surface of the water as though waiting for it to speak. Part of her expected lightning or thunder or some sign of divine judgment. But the sky remained clear. Birds continued to call from the trees. The world, indifferent and cruel, went on. When she finally stepped back onto the bank, her legs felt weak, unfamiliar. She rinsed her hands in the river again, not to clean them. She knew nothing could do that, but out of habit, the same habit that had ruled her life for so long. The weight. Ran over her skin, cool and unjudging, leaving no mark. She gathered the basket and began the walk back toward the plantation. Each step felt unreal, as though she were moving through a dream she might wake from at any moment. Her mind replayed the scene again and again, searching for something, regret, justification, horror, but finding only a vast echoing emptiness. The plantation loomed ahead, unchanged. Smoke curled from chimneys, voices drifted from open windows. Somewhere silverware clinked against plates. Easter dinner was being served. She entered the yard quietly, setting the basket down where she always did. No one noticed her return. No one asked where the children were. It was not unusual for them to play by the river, supervised only by habit and assumption. She wiped her hands on her skirt and waited. Minutes passed, then more. The absence began to register as unease rather than alarm. A servant glanced toward the path, frowning. The master's wife called out sharply, her voice edged with irritation. The children did not answer. The laundress stood still, her expression unreadable. Inside her, something shifted, not triumph, not relief, but a heavy, solemn awareness that there was no going back. Whatever she had been before this moment no longer existed. She had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. When the first shout of panic rang out, it felt distant, muffled, as though heard underwater. People ran toward the river, their movements frantic and disordered. The master followed, his authority cracking under the weight of fear. The laundress remained where she was until summoned, until eyes finally turned toward her with suspicion and dread. She walked back to the river with them, her pace measured. The crowd gathered at the bank, voices rising in confusion and terror. Someone pointed, someone prayed, someone demanded answers. The rive. Offered none. When the truth could no longer be denied, when the weight of loss settled over the plantation like a shroud, the laundress felt the full force of what she had done crash into her. Not as panic, not as remorse in the way they would expect, but as a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The fight was over. The waiting was over. Whatever judgment awaited her would come soon enough. As hands closed around her arms and voices shouted accusations, she did not resist. Resistance would have been pointless now. She had not acted to escape punishment. She had acted because something inside her had demanded release, because the world as it was had become unbearable. As she was led away, she glanced once more at the river. Its surface was calm, reflecting the sky as it always had. It would carry this day with it, just as it carried everything else, sins, secrets, prayers, and pain, moving endlessly toward a horizon no one could see. The act had been committed. The cleansing, if that was what it was complete. What remained was silence, heavy and unrelenting, and a reckoning that no water could wash away. The plantation did not sleep that night. Lanterns burned long past midnight, their yellow glow drifting like uneasy spirits through the yard and along the path to the river. Voices rose and fell in waves, prayers, accusations, commands, none of them able to settle the chaos that had taken hold. Easter had ended in horror, and the holiness proclaimed only hours earlier now rang hollow against the sound of grief. The laundress was kept in a small storage room near the kitchen, the door shut but not locked. Two men stood outside, uncertain whether they were guards or witnesses. No one had told her to sit or stand, so she leaned against the wall, her body finally allowed to rest after a lifetime of motion. Her hands were still damp, her dress heavy with river water thaw. Tea had long since dried, but seemed to cling to her all the same. She stared at the floor, tracing cracks in the wood with her eyes, listening to the distant cries of a mother unraveling. When the master finally came, his face was pale and slack, his authority shattered by loss. He did not strike her, he did not shout. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if the quiet woman who had washed his family's clothes for years had suddenly become something else entirely, something he could not understand or control. "Why?" he asked, a word barely audible. She lifted her eyes slowly. The room seemed smaller now, the air thick with expectation. She searched his face for recognition, for any sign that he might finally see the years of suffering etched into her existence, but found only confusion and wounded pride. "There was too much dirt," she said softly. "Some stains don't come out." Her answer enraged him more than any confession could have. He recoiled as if struck, his grief twisting into fury. He shouted for the overseer, for the sheriff, for God himself if necessary. Orders were barked, plans formed hastily. There would be an investigation, there would be punishment. The world, as he knew it, demanded that order be restored. The laundress was bound before dawn and taken from the plantation under armed watch. Word travelled quickly, faster than anyone expected. By the time they reached the town, people were already whispering, already shaping the story into something easier to swallow. A madwoman, a demon, a savage incapable of reason. No one wanted to hear about years of abuse, about children sold away, about faith used as a weapon. Those truths were too heavy, too uncomfortable. The jail was cold and dark, its walls damp and unforgiving. She was placed alone in a cell, the iron door slamming shut with finality. For the first time since Easter Moor. She was truly alone. No river, no baskets, no commands, just silence and the slow passage of time. In the days that followed, preachers visited her, eager to extract repentance. They spoke of forgiveness and damnation, of sins that could not be undone. She listened politely, answering little. She did not argue theology. She did not beg for mercy. Whatever reckoning she believed in no longer belonged to their language. The trial, when it came, was swift and ceremonial. Witnesses spoke of her quiet nature, her years of service, her sudden and inexplicable cruelty. The master testified last, his voice breaking as he described his children's innocence, their white clothes, their laughter. No one asked her to speak, and she did not volunteer. Her silence was interpreted as proof of guilt rather than a refusal to perform sorrow for those who had never recognized her pain. The verdict was never in doubt. On the morning of her sentence, the town gathered as if for another holiday. Faces were solemn but curious, eager to see justice carried out. She was led through the crowd, her chains clinking softly, her posture straight. She did not search for sympathy. She did not avert her eyes. The river was visible in the distance, glinting beneath the sun, indifferent as ever. The punishment was delivered as the law demanded, clean and public. When it was over, the crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring prayers and reassurances to one another. Order, they told themselves, had been restored. Sin had been punished. The world could continue as it was. But the plantation never truly recovered. The master's wife withdrew from society, her faith collapsing under the weight of unanswered questions. The house grew quiet, its halls echoing with absence. Servants whispered of strange dreams, of water seeping into places it did not belong. The river seemed to rise more often after heavy rains, creeping closer to the fields, as if reminding the land of what it held. Among the enslaved, the story was remembered differently, not spoken aloud, not recorded, but carried in looks and gestures, in the way elders paused when speaking of Easter, in the way laundresses approached the river with a mixture of fear and reverence. The laundress became a symbol, not of violence, but of the breaking point no one acknowledged, until it was too late. Years passed. New families moved onto the land. New sermons were preached. The river continued its slow journey, carrying with it the memory of that day, unchanged by judgment or time. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story, softened or sharpened depending on who told it. Some called her a monster, others called her a warning. History would not remember her name, it would remember the act, stripped of context, reduced to a headline, a cautionary tale about obedience and order. But beneath that version lived another truth, one harder to face, that systems built on cruelty do not collapse loudly. They fracture quietly until one moment exposes everything they tried to hide. The laundress's life ended under the weight of judgment, but her story lingered in the spaces history preferred to ignore. It asked questions no one wanted to answer, about faith without justice, about innocence protected at the cost of other lives, about what happens when suffering is washed and washed until nothing remains but silence. In the end, the river remained the only honest witness. It did not absolve, it did not condemn. It simply carried the truth forward, reminding anyone who listened that water remembers, even when people choose not to. This story reflects the brutal contradictions of 19th century America, where religion and morality were often used to justify oppression rather than confront it. The tragedy is not only in the act itself, but in the long chain of injustice that made such an act imaginable. History frequently records the final moment of violence while erasing the suffering that led to it, and in doing so, it misses the deeper lesson that ignored pain does not disappear, it transforms. Thank you for watching Wusa Buried Stories, where we uncover the hidden truths history tried to forget. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share it with others who care about untold history. Stay connected with us, and don't hesitate to reach out if there's a story you believe deserves to be told. Together, we'll continue digging into the past, because some truths should never stay buried.